Welcome to the Bonnevero discussion group. So we're hosting Inga Winkler today. Inga is a professor of international human rights law at the Central European University in Vienna, Austria. Inga is broadly interested in issues to do with taboo and wants to think around them, to think about how can we mobilize international human rights law to do something about taboo. Inga was also one of the first people, or the first authorities on the right to water, and has worked broadly within the field of socioeconomic rights. I met Inga when we were both at New York University. Inga was then at Columbia University before moving back to Europe. And at that point, Inga had been working for several years with the mandate holder for the right to water and sanitation, the UN Special Rapporteur, Katerina to Albuquerque. So there's a wide sort of long history of thinking through human rights in spaces where they have been underexplored, under-theorized. And what more sort of could you hope for in today's seminar to think about what are the most under-theorized, overlooked, unexpressed, not talked about, taboo topics, menstruation and human rights. So thank you, Inga, for being here. Thank you also to Chelsea, who's agreed to be our commentator for today. Chelsea has had access to a range of Inga's work, so we'll be taking over after Inga's presentation. Chelsea is one of our default students who's working on domestic abuse in Australia, but Chelsea, how many other degrees are you doing currently or at any given time? I cannot keep track.
Too many.
Too many. Not just degrees, but just the number of projects you've been involved in and just the incredible energy that you bring to the projects. So thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Feel free to sit down.
Why don't you grab a seat? Sure. So we have about 30 minutes, Inga. We'll start with your presentation and then Chelsea, you take over for about 20 minutes. We have a good few folks in the room. It would be fantastic to get discussion going, so please do chip in and let's have a nice Q&A with whatever time that we've got left. I hope there's good 15-20 minutes left. So welcome everyone. There are lots of new faces at Bonnevero. Thank you so much for being here. Inga, the floor is yours.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thanks so much for the opportunity. I'm really delighted to be here. And I've been working on menstruation and human rights for a while. But so much of there's a lot happening in the menstrual health space, but so much of it is not in the context of human rights. So this is a really exciting opportunity for me to really frame my thinking hopefully more solidly in the context of human rights. And I would love to hear what you're thinking and really have a good discussion about this. So I remember when I was starting to work on menstruation, which was, it was in the context of working with Katarina, and that's now more than 10 years ago. And at the time, people were looking at me like I just dropped from the sky, and like completely crazy. You're working on what? So many people misunderstood what I was saying, and I think that has changed quite a bit. It's still not like you'd be saying I'm working on the right to education, but at least people no longer look at me the same way. And when you look at kind of what's been happening over the last couple of years, I think we have this really exciting development in the last, 5 to 10 years. There's so much momentum around menstruation and menstrual health. We see civil society organizations working on, we see protests in different countries. There's small community-based organizations, social entrepreneurs. There's also a lot happening at a more global level. We see menstruation covered in the media more and more. You might have seen a couple of years ago that film Period, End of Sentence won an Oscar. There's a period emoji. There's really exciting menstrual art. If you ever have a chance to explore that, there's also a lot happening in the UK. So there is a lot happening. And I do think, I obviously think it matters. Because, menstruation really, obviously, it's a biological, physiological process. It's a natural process. It shouldn't be a big deal. But at the same time, I mean, there's so much more to it, and there's everything kind of we ascribe to it, all the social, cultural stuff about it. I mean, I think it's obvious that menstruation is also political. It's something intimate, but that also reaches into the public sphere. So it's a lot more complex than many people would think at first sight. And I do think that despite kind of everything that has been happening over the last 10 years or so, and much more openness, I do think that menstrual stigma is so deep-seated, so entrenched, that it persists. And I mean, I would love to get you thinking about kind of, I mean, how do you talk about menstruation? I mean, do you have that typical range of euphemisms that I typically hear from students? And wonderful range of languages, but they exist everywhere. I mean, when you're in the bathroom, I mean, how many layers of toilet paper do you use to wrap your menstrual products, or do you put them into the little bags that are provided? Because oh my God, God forbid that someone would see kind of that there is blood even when it's in the disposal. And I mean, are you comfortable talking openly about menstrual cramps when you have them, or do you find, I mean, when you speak to a male colleague or supervisor or professor, I mean, do you tell them that you have a headache? I think, I mean, there are so many studies that show that all of that is happening. So I don't think that. We've really tackled menstrual stigma, and a lot of what's happening is somewhat superficial. And I think that matters because menstrual stigma has such profound effects on the realization of human rights. I mean, just when we look at kind of how menstrual education is taking place, it usually isn't. There's usually something, I mean, very superficial. I mean, now we see a lot of initiatives about menstrual hygiene education that are usually about, I mean, teaching girls how to put menstrual products into their underwear, but it doesn't go beyond that. So there are so many studies that show that, I mean, people at a young age, when they reach menarche and first start menstruating, that they have no idea what's going on and what's happening to their bodies. And I mean, obviously, that causes a lot of anxiety, that causes a lot of stress, and I mean, that impacts how they learn at school and all of that. Or consider, I mean, when you move to the field of health, there are so many studies that show that, for instance, in the context of endometriosis, the average gap between kind of getting to the point where you think that something is wrong and you should get medical advice to actually getting a diagnosis is 7 years. So it's 7 years of moving around from healthcare provider to healthcare provider, trying to convince them that it's not just normal pain. And I mean, that's after the point where you actually feel like, something is going wrong. Someone should have a closer look, and this is not just usual menstrual cramps, and this is not just you should deal with it because that is what people experience when they're menstruating. So I think this gaslighting, this dismissal of menstrual pain, these odysseys through the medical system, and the fact that healthcare providers are not trained to actually deal with menstruation, all that I think has to do with menstrual stigma. Or think about the workplace. I mean, anyone who's menstruating probably has had that experience of being labeled as PMSing. I mean, at least in the US, that's very, very common. Being hysterical, being too emotional, not to be trusted to take any important decisions. And then again, this idea of powering through, and I think these stereotypes, and also, I mean, the resulting lack of accommodation, I mean, that really persists. I mean, at Central European University, we're now trying to think about, I mean, what it would mean to accommodate menstruation and perimenopause and menopause at the workplace. And I mean, part of it is easy. Everyone says yes to menstrual products in the bathrooms, but thinking about what else it would take, there is a lot more resistance to that. And there's a lot of this, but then women would take advantage of it. And if students want excuses, being excused from class, again, they would take advantage of that. So I think all that, really shows how entrenched menstrual stigma is. So I think the exciting opportunity that I see is that there is a lot of momentum around menstruation at the moment, and increasingly framed as a human rights issue. So there's a lot of language that deals with human rights at all levels. So what I'd first like to do quite briefly is to look at how, at a global level, the human rights framing is used. And that's going to be a story of instrumentalization of human rights, of tokenistic use of human rights, of a very reduced understanding of human rights. But then I want to get into that more optimistic part, and that's where I would love to hear also your input. Kind of how else can we think about human rights in the menstrual space? So first, when we look at global organizations, the way this has started in the UN Human Rights Council, in the global kind of development human rights space more broadly, is with a heavy focus on water and sanitation. Now, don't get me wrong. I think to some extent that's great, and it's great to have had that starting point. And that's also how I started thinking about menstruation. And I think, in the water and sanitation context, people are so used to deal with feces, to deal with sludge, to deal with waste management. They don't mind a bit of menstrual blood and mucus. So it was a good starting point. But I think what also comes with the water and sanitation sector, is a heavy focus on facilities. And sanitation and toilets. It's a heavy focus on menstrual products and providing products to people. So everything that's tangible. One of our interviews in a recent study, she said, well, in the Indian context, we like things tangible. That's kind of what the government promotes. That is what gains traction. And I think we see that much more broadly. So in a way, these barriers that I was talking about in the context of education, health, those, we can't tackle those by just focusing on toilets and menstrual products. And that is reinforced by this, what I would characterize as a very tokenistic dignity discourse. And dignity in the sense, when you look at the language in global policy documents, UN documents, kind of what leading NGOs in the field put out, is really this idea of dignity as management, this idea of dignity as privacy, and this message that's imposed on people who menstruate, that they need to manage, that they need to control their bodies, because otherwise it would be a bloody, messy, uncontrollable thing. And you see that in the language that UNFPA, the reproductive rights agency basically of the UN, is using about these dignity kits. And it's all this understanding of that you can and that you must ensure dignity by managing, by keeping yourself clean, by keeping everything hygienic. And I think that's not just this idea that you can be, but it really imposes responsibilities on menstruators, and it creates these expectations that yes, it's on you to make sure that you exercise proper hygiene to keep that leaky body under control. So it's, when you look back, you'll all have seen these typical menstrual ads. Imagine a girl dancing in the sunlight, something flowery, something beautiful at the sea. And the idea is always to keep menstruation concealed and to keep menstruation hidden. And I think that runs through, I mean, even when we do stick the label of human rights onto it, this idea of concealment, of hiding menstruation, that really runs through it. So it's instrumentalizing human rights, it's tokenistic, and then I think it's also very reductionist, because what we focus on is really this idea of water and sanitation, and then maybe some related human rights, this very tokenistic use of dignity. But there's no talking about other human rights in the context of menstruation. And I think there's so many other human rights that would be involved. I mean, education, health, work, culture, freedom of religion, I mean, participation in public life, you name it. And I mean, what we do see when culture is being mentioned, culture is always something negative. It's always about culture and religion as restriction, as a barrier, as a limitation. And then that's done in a very sensationalized way. In a study that I did together with Chris Gobel, we looked at some of that language that's being used. And I mean, the word that you see here, those were the ones that popped up in all of the articles we examined, where menstrual practices, menstrual beliefs were above all, they were described as bizarre and backward, odd, weird, outrageous, wacky, hilarious. I mean, all of those words. And I think what we see, I mean, is these very tropes that we see in the context of other big human rights campaigns, is that the people who menstruate, I mean, usually in the global south, I mean, there are very few articles about what's happening in the global north, and they are described as powerless and oppressed. There's never a positive view of culture. There's no discussion of their agency. And then the suggested answer about how to solve these alleged problems is basically to do away with culture. And I mean, this is because we are in the UK, this is from the Telegraph. And I mean, basically what they were saying as well, I mean, in Britain and Western Europe, thankfully, we've moved on. And then, I mean, there's this beautiful lumping together of all of Africa and all of India, who are expected to move on and do away with their cultural traditions. But I mean, this is not, I mean, if this were an exception, I could live with it, but we had some close to 100 articles that all had very similar tropes. And it's always this idea that we need to move from something backward, from something that's steeped in culture, to something that's perceived as modern, and it's this embrace of neoliberal markets, because then, of course, the products, the menstrual products, come in and serve as the savior. So it's a savior on the wings of an always pad. Yeah. So, and I think this is kind of, I mean, what we see in the kind of mainstream human rights discourse, and I'm incredibly frustrated with it, because I do think, I mean, that human rights have a lot more potential to think about menstruation, but we also need to get it right. And I mean, so far what I've seen is this very restrictive, tokenistic, reductionist use of human rights. But I guess, I mean, anyone who's been working in this space, none of this sounds really surprising, because I think this is what we see in so many other human rights contexts, human rights discussions. And I mean, it aligns, I mean, it matches, I mean, it's almost scary how well it matches onto more general critiques of human rights. But then I do think that there is something in the human rights framework that is worth thinking about, and that has potential, I mean, for kind of re-envisioning how we think about human rights, how we understand human rights, and that's kind of where I'm at the moment in the project. So I mean, I've been started to do interviews with a lot of the grassroots movements that work in the menstrual health space, and how they understand human rights is so much more interesting and so much more encompassing. So I think rather than kind of understanding human rights in this very limited way, I would say, I mean, that if we think about human rights kind of at a crossroads, there's hopefully something where we can really re-envision how we understand human rights. I mean, drawing on the experience of so many grassroots movements that are largely in the global south. And I mean, as Radna Kapoor put it, I mean, human rights are something that we cannot not want. So I mean, doing away with it, and I mean, I assume that all of you are here at the Bonavera Institute. I mean, you probably don't want to do away with it entirely. But I do think, I mean, that there is a lot of rethinking that is needed. So some of the, I mean, just to give you a few kind of teasers of what I've seen so far. I think what's exciting is that the menstrual movement, I mean, really is rather recent, and it's a new kind of collective of people coming together. So I do think there's an opportunity there to rethink how we do human rights. And I think one of those actors is the Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation, which is based in Nepal, but has been putting together this international network of people who work in the menstrual health space. And they focus, I mean, they do a lot of work in Nepal, obviously, but then they also think about kind of how do we redefine these narratives? How do we move from menstrual hygiene, which again is trending because on Sunday we'll have Menstrual Hygiene Day, but how do we move to something broader, and how do we understand dignity in that context? And then they think a lot about how to situate menstruation, I mean, in the context of patriarchal power relations, and kind of they see the bigger picture, I would say. And then, I mean, other organizations that I think do really exciting work. There's the Pacific Network on menstrual health that's very much rooted in women's rights organizations, feminist organizations, LGBTQ organizations, so not coming out of the WASH space. There's also a really exciting group of Dalit activists in India that look at the intersection of caste and menstruation and what impurity means in that context, and how they understand menstrual traditions, menstrual practices in that context. There's also the Period Equality Network that's operating in Eastern Africa. So this is kind of what gives me hope to see, I mean, many young activists, some of us not so young, working in the space and really thinking about, well, what else is there to really bring human rights to their potential, and to think about, I mean, how can we, if we go back to the normative human rights standards, how can we frame those in a broader way than just limiting ourselves to what I presented at the beginning. And I think part of what this means to understand human rights more comprehensively, I mean, obviously it gets messier, and it's not as limited. But I think the first point I want to make, what I consider important, is to really think about all the human rights that are impacted. I mean, from work and safe and healthy working conditions, to education, to freedom of religion or belief, cultural rights, taking part in public life. I mean, obviously, equality, non-discrimination, gender justice, but also then how gender intersects with so many other forms of discrimination and marginalization. I mean, the right to health, the right to housing. I think all those rights are related to menstruation in some way or another. Well, and then thinking about, I mean, what do these human rights principles that we always talk about, about non-discrimination, about voice, participation, and agency, about accountability. What do these really mean, and how do grassroots movements use these? And I think that prompts us to ask a lot of questions about what we currently do in the space and how we can do better. Because what I see at the moment is that there is a heavy focus on, what you could say is the default menstruator. So it's either adolescents or it's white women, basically speaking. But there's very little attention to any kind of intersections and intersection of different identity. And I think a lot of the programming that we see in the space is focused on girls in schools. So we're not thinking about girls who are not in school, so they are even further marginalized. We don't really think, that much beyond adolescence. I'm still menstruating, but then we don't, we certainly don't think about perimenopause, menopause, and there's a lot of, needs that change, a lot that changes for women and people who menstruate. We also, I think we are starting to address, at least at a very superficial level, the needs of trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming menstruators, and there's some exciting work happening in that space, but at a very, very low level. And I think a lot of that, where the discussion is centered at the moment, I think, is in the language we use, which I find very exciting. We just published a paper on that. But it needs to move beyond the language, and it needs to be a lot more, also about practical needs, and also about kind of lived experiences of people, how they experience menstruation. We need to think a lot more about the needs of menstruators with disabilities. There's a lot happening with forced sterilization that colleagues of mine have worked on. And we need to think about how menstrual stigma intersects with caste, with class, with culture, with religion, and so many other factors. And I think too often that is kind of what we ignore. And when I speak to policymakers, I often hear, but we're just getting started, and there's so little that's happening, and we haven't even reached all the girls in schools yet. So we can't give us a bit more time, and then we'll move on to the other people. And I think, we need to turn that on its head, and be much more inclusive from the beginning. And then I think, obviously, speaking about this from a human rights perspective, what I think really matters is participation, voice, and agency. And really deciding how you want to manage your menstrual flow, but more than that. It's not just about your choice of product, whether you want to use a cup or a pad or something else, but it's also, do you want to engage in particular cultural activities or not? And how does your religion, how does your culture factor into that? And that I would see in response to kind of this very restrictive view of culture, to also acknowledge that people might choose not to engage in certain activities because that is what their religion tells them, and that is what they consider important. We did a fascinating study with women, mostly middle-aged women in Trinidad in the Hindu diaspora, that a grad student of mine led, and she interviewed them, in their temple communities, and most of them were like, well, on the days that we menstruate, we wouldn't, most of them did go to the temple, but then they wouldn't partake in rituals, they wouldn't make any offerings. There were certain practices that they kept and that they considered incredibly important, and for them that was part of being Hindu, and that is what was meant to them. And I mean, going in and telling them, oh, but doesn't this stigmatize you, and doesn't this feel wrong to you? I mean, it did it. It felt very right to them not to engage in certain things, and to stay away from certain practices, because that is what their religion meant to them. And I think acknowledging that, I mean, engaging in cultural practices, I mean, decision making means you can take different decisions, and really recognizing that people can decide different things and have different priorities. I think that is absolutely key. Well, and then of course, I mean, for me, this whole idea of dignity comes in there as well, and. I mean, coming from a human rights perspective, I mean, that whole scholarship on dignity is slightly overwhelming, just ever so slightly. But I think what it definitely shows, I mean, is that there's a lot more to dignity than just dignity as management, and I think that dignity has a lot to do with agency, a lot to do with autonomy, a lot to do with decision making, and I mean one study that I'm drawing on was done in the context of nursing, and the question that they asked is, I mean, how do people who require elder care and who require nursing, how do they understand and conceptualize their dignity? Does dignity mean to them that someone comes every day and washes them, cuts their hair, shaves them, I mean, whatever is needed or is considered necessary? So is that kind of dignity? Or does dignity mean to them that they decide? And if they don't want to be shaved, or if they don't want to be washed, then this is what dignity means to them. And I think this kind of is more, I don't know, I guess outside this understanding, traditional understanding of, well, but it requires cleanliness, it requires hygiene. I think that really maps onto what we see in the menstrual health space. So I do think there's a lot in kind of a broader understanding of dignity that really emphasizes people's agency and autonomy and really decision making. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at the moment. And then I think the last, I mean, human rights principle, I mean, that I consider, I mean, really important, and that I also see reflected in the work that people are doing. I was just interviewing a South African activist, and she was speaking at length about accountability, that the work she's doing, I mean, that it's not charity, that it's not passing on products or training or anything like that to anyone else, but that it's really about, I mean, also, I mean, holding herself accountable, or the organization she works with accountable, and seeing how they operate in the space, who they respond to, I mean, what the needs are, how they engage people in decision making, and I think again that is something that's lacking in the space. I mean, that is so driven by product drives and charity events, and I think we need to kind of move beyond that and think about, I mean, what are the human rights obligations in the space. And I think that has a lot to do with creating, I mean, in terms of government obligation, that has a lot to do with creating that enabling environment, which means promoting menstrual literacy, menstrual education, it means promoting workplaces that are menstruation friendly, tackling gender stereotypes and intersecting stigma. And I think it's, in particular, those obligations that are least tangible and least visible, that are probably the most important ones, I would think. So moving on from there, kind of where I'm at the moment is really to look more closely in terms of how do grassroots movements, how do organizations around the world in the global movement, different groups, different activists, how do they conceptualize human rights? And then hopefully also looking into kind of how do they influence, to some extent or not, but how do they influence global policy, and to what extent are their voices heard at the global level? So for instance, the Global South Coalition, I mean, they've been running a lot of events at the Commission on the Status of Women in New York. So I'm interested in kind of seeing how what's happening in communities around the world, how that's being reflected at the global level. This is just a bit of advertising about the handbook that we did that includes a lot of these different voices. I think that's all I have, and I would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, how Chelsea, your thoughts, but also everyone else's, how you think that we can re-envision how human rights work and how we do human rights. So this transformative potential that we always talk about, that actually becomes reality.
Thank you so much, Inga. Thank you. Could we take